Hey, Hammy here with section 2.2 for AP Biology, in which we will look at elements and compounds. First, just a review of some of the terminology. Molecule is where you have two or more elements bonded together. So, for example, later we're going to look at sodium chloride. You have one molecule of table salt. Or hydrogen gas. It can be two of the same atoms bonded together. So when you got two more atoms bonded together, they are going to make a molecule. Okay, a molecule. Okay, a lot of times in biology, we will use molecule and compound kind of interchangeably. Compound is when you have different elements, two different elements bonded together. So sometimes a molecule like hydrogen gas is still just that element, but it's in molecular form, like we say diatomic. Oxygen gas, O2, would be another example where you have molecules of oxygen. So it's that element, but it's in its molecular form. Whereas a compound, you've got different elements bonded together. CO2, carbon dioxide, H2O, water, glucose. But a lot of times in bio, we'll kind of interchange those a little bit, a molecule and a compound. A formula tells us in a certain compound or molecule what elements or atoms are in there and what ratio or how much of each. So if we take a look at that, we'll use a compound called azurite. Okay. I tried to pick one here with a very complicated chemical formula. All right. So it's made up of copper, hydroxide ions, and carbonate ions. Okay. So we got a lot going on here, but it shows us this pretty blue rock here, these crystals. This formula tells us what's in there. Okay. So we've got Cu, which are copper ions. We've got these capital O's. Okay, OH is not an element. Okay, the O is for oxygen. The H is for hydrogen. And then C for carbon. And then more oxygens out here. Okay, now these little things here are called subscripts. If there is no subscript, like the O and the H and the C right here, there is no substrate. It's subscript. It's just assumed to be one. Okay. These tell us how many of the atoms. This big number that you sometimes see before the formula is called a coefficient. That tells us we have 3 azurite molecules. Okay, so how this works is this 3 tells us there are 3 coppers in the molecule, and this coefficient we have 3 molecules. So if each molecule has 3 coppers and you have 3 molecules, obviously 3 times 3, total we would have 9 copper. Okay, the oxygen now gets a little bit tricky. This is saying in the parenthesis here, you have 2 OH groups. So if you have OH and OH, okay, how many oxygens are there? You have to multiply 2 times 1. So there's 2 oxygens, but times the coefficient is 3. So that gives us 6 oxygens, but we can't forget these oxygens over here. Okay, so here we have 3 oxygens and a carbonate ion, but we have 2 carbonate ions. So if you have CO3, CO3, there's 3 and 3, that's 6. So 2 times 3 is 6, times 2 molecules. 6 times 3 is 18. You add those together, that gives you 24 atoms of oxygen. The hydrogen, same thing. 2 times 1 is 2, times 3, okay, is 6 hydrogen. Carbon over here, 2 times 1 is 2, times 3 is 6. Okay, so if we look at our totals, in 3 molecules of azurite, we've got 9 molecules of copper, 9 atoms of copper, 24 oxygen atoms, 6 hydrogen atoms, and 6 carbon atoms. Okay, so these formulas tell us like what specific ratio, and sometimes with the parentheses with polyatomic ions, you'll learn more about that in chemistry, how they all combine together to make this pretty blue rock over here. The last thing we want to look at in this section are the 2 main types of bonding that occur in biology that we talk about or refer to. Okay, bonds are the things that are holding the atoms together in a molecule. Okay, and in order to do that, that takes energy. Okay, the bonds are usually caused by the either transfer or sharing of the outermost electrons. You remember those outermost electrons we call the valence electrons. Okay, so it's this interaction of the valence electrons that will cause atoms to stick or bond together. And there's energy stored in that bond, and that is very important in the biological systems. It's a type of potential energy because that energy can be stored, can be made and stored in those bonds, and then released when a cell would need energy for something. Okay, and this is always done through different kinds of chemical reactions. Ones that just happen spontaneously on their own usually give off energy, and ones that need special enzymes and help and to put together usually are need an input of energy. Okay, the first type of bonding is ionic bonding. Now, an ion is an atom that has lost or gained an electron. So we remember we said that we say that atoms of an element tend to be electrically neutral. So they have the same number of positive protons as negative electrons. Okay, so they're chemically neutral, but they're not chemically or electrically neutral, but they're not chemically stable because they like to follow that octet rule, okay, where they like to have a full outer energy level of electrons. So ionic bonds happen when one or more electrons jump ship, or we say they're transferred from one atom to another. So now you have more or less negative charges, and that atom is now going to be charged, and we call it an ion. So the example we want to look at here is sodium chloride. Okay, there's a lot going on here on this slide, but if we look at sodium, Na, and we find it just over here, this is kind of a rough version of the periodic table showing our valence electrons. In chemistry, you'll learn about Lewis dot structures. Right here, we can see sodium has one outer electron. Okay, so not very stable. So it's got 2 in the first level, 8 in the next level, and then just this one lonely electron out here, which makes it very reactive, because if it could just boot that electron, now it would be stable, chemically stable. So it boots that electron. Well, if there's a chlorine atom nearby, if we find chlorine here on our periodic table, we'll notice in the Lewis dot that it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So close to the octet rule. See, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Just has an empty spot right here. Just need to fill that, and then it could be stable. So what happens is this electron will jump ship from the sodium and come join the chlorine. So now this can drop back a level and have 8. If we kind of look down here, sodium now has 8. That red one right here jumped over here. So now chlorine has 8. But now sodium has 1 extra proton and 1 less electron, giving it a +1 charge. Chlorine, because it gained an extra negative electron, now has one more electron than proton. So it has a -1 charge. We say that these are ions. And opposites attract. If you have a +1 and a -1, they will, after the electron jump ship, they will stick together. Okay, and that gives us an ionic compound called NaCl, sodium chloride, and it a lot of times will form these crystalline structures. Okay, so there's like table salt, like we think of, but if you look at it under the microscope, you'd see these little cubes. Why does it crystal up? Because the sodium chlorine, the chlorine look is much bigger than the sodium, and it'll sort of form this little crystal lattice here where you have, they will all alternate together, and it will sort of build out sort of in this cube shape. Okay. We also, we call this a salt. A lot of things, ionic compounds that are salts, will dissolve in water. So when you put it into water, the water, and we'll talk about the polar properties of water in the next video, will kind of pull the sodium ion away from the chloride ion. And so you pour salt in water, it will slowly dissolve, and these two ions will get pulled apart. So we call those salts. The second type of bond is a covalent bond. Okay, bond number 2 that's important in biology, and we'll actually use covalent bonds way more, or we'll represent them and talk about them a lot more than ionic bonds. This is when two atoms share. So in ionic bonds, the electron jumped ship, and now they had a charge. In covalent bonds, those electrons are shared so that the octet rule, or the valence level, is full. Okay, and they can also be polar and nonpolar. So I want to look at kind of a nonpolar bonds first. Okay, for example, hydrogen. And hydrogen gas is always a good example to kind of start with, to remind you that in the octet rule, so small that it can only hold 2. So it goes 2, 8, 8. We probably won't go much past that third level in AP biology. So hydrogen has 1, and it finds another hydrogen that has 1. It's like, man, if I would just have one more electron, I could be stable. So they scoot up next to each other, and they share electrons, sharing them. So this electron will spin around this atom some of the time, and then it will spin around this atom some of the time. So that electron spends time around both atoms. Okay, it'll go around both atoms, and it shares. It spends time in both. That holds those two atoms together. Okay, we represent that with a structural formula with a line. H with the chemical symbol H for hydrogen, line H. That line represents a pair of shared electrons. Your book says to think of it as like a handshake. You both have to reach out. Okay, you both have to reach out and grab hands. So it takes 2 of you, takes 2 electrons, and it's connecting you together. Okay, the molecular formula we would then just write as a diatomic molecule, H2. Okay. Oxygen gas, very similar. We're just moving up to the next level. Okay, oxygen has 6 electrons, 6 valence electrons. Remember, in the second level, it needs 8. So they take 2 electrons, and they will share 2 pairs of electrons. Okay, one of these is coming from each one. So 2 pairs, this would be a double bond, or what we need to live, right? Oxygen gas. Down here is methane, one of the most basic kind of carbon compounds, and a lot of stuff. Next chapter we talk about will look similar to this, and we'll build off of this. A carbon has 4 valence electrons, and it needs 8. So it has kind of 4 empty spots. And if a hydrogen, it doesn't always have to be the same atom bonding together. You can take a hydrogen, we'll scoot up close to it, and over here another hydrogen will scoot up close over here. And so this hydrogen will have its 2, and if you plug in 1, 2, 3, 4 hydrogens, they're all happy. And the carbon is now happy because it gained another 4 electrons to give its total of 8. So we represent that, okay, this is methane. We represent that as carbon in the middle with a hydrogen, a hydrogen, a hydrogen, a hydrogen, okay? So for its structural formula, or if you just write the molecular formula, CH4. Those are all nonpolar. They are all sharing them equally. In a polar covalent bond, they are shared unequally. Okay. In water, for example, okay, you've got an oxygen, okay, that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 valence electrons. So it has 2 empty spots. You'll get a hydrogen over here that will share one here, and a hydrogen that will share one down here. So this is oxygen, hydrogen, hydrogen. But the problem is oxygen has a greater electronegativities. And when you take chemistry class, you'll talk about electronegativities. It's the ability of the atom to attract the electrons and towards their atom. So actually the electrons spend more time spinning around the oxygen than they do around the hydrogen. So if you have those negative electrons around the oxygen more than they are around the hydrogen, you have more of a negative charge on one end than the other end of the molecule. So what you get is something that looks like this. Here's our oxygen bonded with 2 hydrogens, but if the electrons are spinning around more time around here than they are around here, okay, this side, the oxygen side of the molecule, is going to be what we call slightly negative. Okay, not like an ion, not that much of a charge, but just slightly negative charge over here, or partially negative. And the hydrogen side of the molecule is going to be slightly positive. Okay, so that means, when we say polar, like North Pole, South Pole, okay, the magnetic fields of our Earth, there's 2 kind of different ends. This molecule is polar because it has a slightly negative and a slightly positive end. Okay, so it has slightly different opposite ends. Okay, and polar covalent bonds, polar covalent bonds set up very unique properties. And when we talk about water, it gives water some very interesting properties, and properties that make life here on Earth possible. And in the next video, we'll talk properties of water and how this polar covalence really gives its property and makes life possible here on Earth.